Hello and welcome to Computer Side Chat number 4, where today we will be picking up from where we left off in the last set of notes. Now, if you recall, the last thing we had talked about was the fight for American independence and what government looked like early on in the new United States. Now, if you recall, the first structure of government we had, our first constitution, was something called the Articles of Confederation, which basically put all of the power in the states and had a very small federal government with very few things to do. Now, we focused a lot on what were the weaknesses and problems of structuring government the way the Articles did. We talked about how basically the federal government wasn't able to get things done. You basically needed a supermajority in Congress to actually pass laws in a unanimous vote to pass amendments. We talked about things like the inability to tax or the inability to regulate trade with outside countries. Basically, the federal government couldn't do the things it needed to do. And because of that, we saw major issues arise. Things like an inability to pay back war debts or pay off soldiers who had fought in the Revolutionary War. And lastly, we saw kind of the culminating event being what we called Shays' Rebellion. Basically, a whole bunch of angry farmers who were being hurt by the poor American economy and were about to see their farms foreclosed on, basically rose up in rebellion. And we left off by saying, well, something really needs to change here. This obviously isn't working. So that's where we're going to pick up today with the Constitutional Convention, Federalists and Anti-Federalists. So what is the Constitutional Convention? Let's answer that question first. So after Shays' Rebellion, basically all the major heads of Congress and the heads of state realize, hey, we really need to take a look at this and figure out how we can make government more effective. So they call for a convention in Philadelphia, and their initial goals is to basically amend the Articles of Confederation so that the government under the Articles can be more effective and actually get its job done. Basically, prevent the things like Shays' Rebellion, actually be able to function as a single country. That is their initial goal. Now, who was present? Well, 12 of the 13 states are present. Rhode Island decides not to attend. There are 55 delegates from those 12 states, and the two most important ones that we care about are James Madison and George Washington. Now, Madison is initially picked to be the author of a stronger national government. However, by the end of this convention, he will be more fondly remembered as the author of the U.S. Constitution and basically the father of the U.S. Constitution. We'll get to that in a second. Secondly, George Washington is there to preside over the convention. He is essentially there to make sure that things move forward, things get done, and the convention takes care of the things that it needs to take care of. So those are the roles of those two individuals. So now that we know who was there, what do they agree on pretty much immediately? Well, very early on, they pretty much all 55 agree on the fact that, you know what, we're not actually here to amend the Articles of Confederation. We are going to just throw out the whole thing, and we are going to create a new constitution. So they agree it is time to get rid of the Articles of Confederation. Secondly, they agree that government needs to be limited. That's something we've already talked a lot about. They believe that strict limits need to be placed on any stronger federal government. They believe that federal government also needs to have a separation of powers. There need to be specific branches with specific jobs to make sure that one part of the government doesn't become too powerful. And lastly, and I've kind of already hit on it, is they all agreed that the national or federal government needs to be stronger. They need to actually be able to do things like impose taxes or pass laws or regulate trade. Those things need to be changed. So these are the basic agreements that they come to. But again, remember, these are 55 delegates from 12 states, all very different people, very different backgrounds with very different interests. So while they have these basic agreements, the details is where things start to get hairy and there start to be issues with that. So let's jump into the first really hotly debated topic as we look at the decisions and compromises that came out of this convention. So the most hotly debated topic was representation or number of votes in Congress. Now, if you remember back to the Articles of Confederation, Congress was structured in a way that representation was equal. Each state had one vote, regardless of size. Representation was equal across the board. And to get a law passed, 9 out of 13 states had to vote for something. So a lot of plans come out to try and restructure this or tweak this, with two sides emerging early on. Basically, big states with large populations on one side and small states with small populations on the other. And so two major plans emerge. The first is known as the Virginia Plan, and this was actually supported by James Madison. So what does the Virginia Plan call for? Well, the first thing that the Virginia Plan calls for is a stronger federal government, as I've hit on several times now. And it also calls for a Congress where representation is decided by the size of your population. In other words, a large state like Virginia might have 10 representatives in Congress. In other words, they have 10 votes in Congress. A small state like Rhode Island might only have like 2 representatives or 2 votes in Congress. So basically, the bigger states have more of a say than the smaller states because the bigger states contain more American citizens. Who preferred this plan? Well, obviously the larger states were more in favor of this. This gave them more power and more of a say. The counter to this plan was something called the New Jersey Plan. And the New Jersey Plan called for a unicameral Congress, which, if you remember, that means Congress is one chamber or one section. And representation is equal. So basically keep it the way it was under the Articles of Confederation. Each state gets one representative or one vote. It is equal across the board. And so obviously smaller states preferred this. This meant that even if your population was really small, like in a state like Rhode Island, you still had the same amount of say as a large state like Virginia. So neither side is really budging on where they want to go with this, if they're going to kind of surrender and let the other side win. And so finally a plan comes out that meets in the middle. And we call this the Connecticut Compromise. And the way that it structures Congress is how Congress is structured today. So what does Congress look like under the compromise? Well, basically, it splits Congress into a bicameral legislature. In other words, Congress is split into 2 sections or chambers. And so this is the important part that you're going to want to write down. It split Congress into a bicameral legislature. In one chamber or section was the Senate, where representation is equal. Basically, each state had 2 representatives or 2 votes in the Senate. So this was basically the half of Congress that utilized the New Jersey Plan. The other section or chamber of Congress, known as the House of Representatives, based its number of representatives on population. So in other words, larger state had more representatives or votes than smaller states. So the House basically takes on the Virginia Plan. To pass a law has to pass in both chambers of Congress. So essentially, it's splitting Congress in half and giving everyone what they want. On one side, you have the Virginia Plan. On the other side, you have the New Jersey Plan. And so this is accepted. This is how things go forward. And again, that is how our Congress is shaped today. So moving forward, what are some of the other decisions and compromises that the convention comes to? Well, next is on interstate commerce or trade. And so they decide that the federal government will be in charge of regulating trade with foreign countries and also regulating interstate trade, or basically trade that goes from one state to another. If there's something that crosses the border between 2 states, then it is up to the federal government to regulate that area of the economy. So they decide on that. They decide they're also going to create something called the Electoral College. We still use this today, and we will talk more about this in class and also later in the semester when we talk about elections. But we still use the Electoral College today, and basically what it is that when a presidential election comes around, Rather than citizens of voting on a presidential candidate, they vote on electors who then vote for the president for them. Again, that's how we still do it today. We'll talk more about that in class, but they create this electoral college. They also agree on 4-year presidential terms. Essentially, if you are elected president, you're in office for 4 years, and then you go back up for re-election. Lastly, they come up with something called the 3/5 Compromise. This is hopefully familiar to you from earlier American history classes, but let's review it a little bit. So basically, there is a dispute between northern states and southern slaveholding states. Southern states want slaves to be counted as part of their population so they can have more representatives in the House. Northern states don't want slaves to be counted as part of the population because, again, that gives the southern states an advantage. It lets them have more of a say in Congress. So they come up with a compromise, and it's called the 3/5 Compromise. And basically what this states is that for every 5 slaves in your state, 3 of them can be counted towards your population. In other words, if you are a slave, you are 3/5 of a person, and you're counted towards the population that way. Outlawing slavery, giving slaves any type of basic rights or anything, that was not discussed, or at least was not included. This is really the only mention of slavery in the Constitution, and it's basically about saying slaves are less than actual people. So we'll get more into the details of what the Constitution looks like in detail next week. All we need to know right now is those basic compromises and decisions. The convention agrees on that, and so they have a basic plan ready to go. And so now the hard part starts, which is basically getting all 13 states to say, yes, we will agree to make this the new Constitution and the new structure for government in the United States. And so this leads to the battle to ratify or accept the new Constitution. Very quickly, this turns into a debate between 2 major groups. The first group is the Federalists, and this is the group led by guys like James Madison. And so the Federalists believe 2 main things. Number 1, they believe that the new Constitution should be ratified. They believe that this is a good way to structure government. Number 2, they believe that federal government needs to be more powerful and need to have more of a say in how the country is run. So that is the big ideas of the Federalists. We think this plan is a good one and we should accept it, and we need a strong federal government with a president at the head of it that can actually get things done. That is what Federalists believe. The counter to them comes in a group known as the Anti-Federalists. And the Anti-Federalists believe, number 1, that under this new Constitution, the federal government is way too powerful. Number 2, they believe that the majority of power should remain with the states. In other words, they essentially want to keep the Articles of Confederation, but tweak the things that the U.S. is having issues with. They want to basically fix the problems, but keep the majority of government power in the hands of the states. And the reason they believe that is because, number 3, they believe that state governments can attend to individual rights better than federal government. In other words, they believe a state government is more able to deal with the problems of their specific state or their specific people than, say, a large, powerful federal government would be able to. So that's what the Anti-Federalists believe. And they're essentially leading the charge to prevent this Constitution from becoming reality. So there's a big back and forth between these two, and to actually get this thing ratified, the Federalists need 9 out of 13 states to vote in favor of the new U.S. Constitution. And they get those 9. New Hampshire is the 9th state to ratify and make the U.S. Constitution official. The 4 other states quickly follow suit. Rhode Island, who, if you remember, did not attend the Constitutional Convention, is the last state to ratify and accept And so after this, it is official. The U.S. Constitution has replaced the Articles of Confederation and is in effect, as it still is today. So the Federalists win this and the Anti-Federalists lose. However, the Anti-Federalists do win one major victory, and that is in the creation of the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments of the Constitution that lay out the basic rights and freedoms of all American citizens. So these are things like right to free speech, right to bear arms, right to a fair and speedy trial. These are what are in the Bill of Rights. The Anti-Federalists wanted this because they felt it was important that if we're going to have a larger and stronger federal government, we need these limits and these protections in place. So that wraps up our notes for tonight and also wraps up everything we need to know for our first test, which we will talk about the date for that this week. From here, we're going to take a deeper look at Federalists, Anti-Federalists, the Articles of Confederation, and kind of the back and forth of what they believed. Then we will start preparing for the test. So from here, make sure you go and take the quizzes. If you have any questions for me, let me know. Other than that, have a great night, and I will see you guys tomorrow.